My name is Hannah. I was 33 years old when my world fractured in ways I could never have predicted. The first crack came with grief, but the second came with betrayal. Betrayal by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It was Christmas Eve inside Las Vegas Medical Center, the air thick with disinfectant and loneliness. My abdomen felt like knives twisting and grinding with every breath. I was waiting for emergency surgery, terrified of what the doctors had told me, terrified of what might happen to my two children if I did not make it through. Ethan and Emily, my 2-year-old twins, sat quietly in the corner of the hospital room. They were too young to understand why their mother was pale and clutching her side. Their innocence was almost unbearable against the cold truth pressing down on me. I had tried everything, exhausted, every option, and finally did the one thing I had dreaded. I called my parents. I thought blood ties would mean something. I thought the word family still had weight. But when my mother's voice came through the phone, sharp and echoing, I knew I had been wrong. "Do not you dare ask us to cancel our plans again," she snapped. "We have had these Elton John tickets for months." The sound of her voice bounced off the sterile walls, slicing through me more viciously than the pain in my stomach. I gripped the phone harder, my hands trembling. How could she sound so annoyed, so inconvenienced when her only daughter was begging for help? I told her I needed someone to care for the twins while I went into surgery. Just a few hours, just so I would know they were safe. But instead of concern, my father's words landed like a blade. "You are becoming a burden, Hannah. We are retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems." A burden, that was the word he used. It rang in my ears, a cruel anthem louder than the monitors beeping beside me. I had been giving them $2,500 every month for 3 years. I carried their mortgage, their bills, their so-called retirement. Even after James died 6 months earlier, I kept sending the money. I told myself it was love, that families stood together, that maybe one day they would see me as more than the shadow behind my younger sister Jessica, their golden child. But in this moment, staring at my babies while my parents chose a concert over my life, I realized the truth. I had been nothing more than an afterthought all along. The nurse Valerie touched my shoulder gently. Her kindness nearly undid me. She did not judge me for crying, for shaking. She simply said, "Let me call my friend Olivia. She is a nanny who specializes in trauma care. She can be here tonight." The contrast was almost unbearable, strangers offering compassion while my own blood rejected me. I nodded. Tears streamed down my face, hot and endless. I whispered, "Yes, please call her." At that moment, something inside me shifted. The ties I had clung to all my life, the invisible leash of guilt and obligation, snapped. My parents had chosen Elton John over me. They had chosen indifference over love. And I chose freedom. That night was not only the beginning of surgery to save my life. It was the beginning of surgery on my soul, cutting out the poison of a family who had never truly loved me, and daring to believe I could build something better. So, the hours before surgery felt like an eternity. My body was weak, but my mind would not stop racing. As I sat in that stark hospital bed, the reality of my parents' rejection kept replaying in my head. I thought of every moment I had sacrificed for them, every check I had mailed, every time I chose their comfort over my own stability. Yet when I needed them the most, they chose flashing lights, music, and champagne over their own daughter and her children. Valerie stayed with me, her calm presence steadying the storm in my chest. Ethan leaned against her leg while Emily clutched her stuffed giraffe eyes wide and uncertain. I wanted to hold them, to promise them I would be fine. But the truth was, I did not know if I would make it through the night. I whispered to Valerie, "Do you think Olivia can really handle them? They are still so little." Valerie smiled. "She has worked with children who have seen more pain than most adults. Trust me, she will treat them like her own." It was a strange feeling, trusting strangers while cutting ties with blood. Yet it felt right. In that instant, I understood that family was not just the people who shared your DNA. Family was those who showed up when life tested you. As I stared at my twins, something inside me hardened. For years, I had told myself that if I kept giving, if I kept bending, maybe my parents would finally accept me. But all my giving had done was teach them to take more. They had grown comfortable with my sacrifice, and I had grown invisible. Not anymore. I asked Valerie to bring me my phone. My hands trembled as I typed. One message went to my bank canceling every future transfer to my parents' account. The second message went directly to them. I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve more than being an afterthought. Do not contact me again. As soon as I hit send, I felt a surge of clarity. Fear was still there, of course. Fear of surgery, fear of recovery, fear of raising 2 toddlers alone. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a current of freedom I had never known before. I looked at Ethan and Emily again. My father had called me a burden, but in that moment I knew the truth. I was not a burden. I was a mother, a protector, a fighter. And I would not let anyone, family, or not convince me otherwise again. The hospital staff bustled around preparing me for the operation. Lights glared above me as they rolled my bed down the corridor. The twins' faces were the last thing I saw before the doors swung closed. 2 little souls depending on me, and I swore silently that no matter what, I would find a way to give them a life where they were never made to feel unwanted. For so long I had chased my parents' approval. Now, lying on that gurney, I realized I no longer needed it. Their rejection was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. Without their control, I could finally decide who I wanted to be. And I wanted to be someone my children could be proud of. Before I go deeper into what happened after surgery, I want to pause here and ask you something. Stories like mine are not rare. Many of you watching may have felt like outsiders in your own families carrying weight that was never yours to carry. If you know that pain, if you have ever been told, you are a burden by the very people who should love you unconditionally, share your story in the comments. It is time we remind each other that we are not alone. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, make sure to subscribe. It helps me keep telling the truths families often bury. That night, as the anesthesia pulled me under, I thought I might never wake again. But instead of fear, my final thought was a strange sort of relief. If I did not survive, at least my children would not be raised to believe that love had to be earned by sacrifice. If I did survive, well, I was going to start rewriting the story of our lives from that moment on. When I opened my eyes after surgery, weak but alive, I knew the old Hannah had been cut away, along with the damaged tissue inside me. What remained was someone new, someone ready to live without apology, without chains, and without the toxic love I had once begged for. When I woke up after surgery, the world felt blurred, as if I were looking through water. The ceiling lights seemed distant voices, muffled. My body ached in every direction, and the incision throbbed with a deep, punishing pulse. But I was alive. I was here. And as I turned my head and saw Ethan curled on a chair with his blanket, and Emily resting on Olivia's lap, I realized, maybe for the first time, that I had chosen the right family. Olivia looked up and smiled softly. "You did it," she whispered. "They are safe." Safe. That word rang in my chest. Because safe had never been what my childhood felt like. My parents always spoke about stability, about family first. Yet behind those words was a different truth. Growing up, it was Jessica who was showered with approval, while I had to fight for scraps of acknowledgement. I remember one memory as if it happened yesterday. It was the weekend of my college graduation. I had worked myself ragged to finish with honors. I thought just maybe they would be proud. But that same weekend, Jessica was featured in a small commercial for a local clothing store. And of course, that was the story my parents talked about at every family gathering, not my degree. Not the nights I stayed awake until sunrise to study. Just Jessica, their shining star. Later, when I married James, their first complaint was about the venue. "It's too far," my mother whined. "Why couldn't you pick somewhere closer to home?" Even on my wedding day, their focus was on their own convenience, not on celebrating the moment. When Ethan and Emily were born, I thought the arrival of grandchildren might finally stir something real in them. But after one visit, they decided the babies were too fussy and made excuses not to come again. I was left holding 2 newborns, exhausted and bleeding, while my parents went off to brunch with friends. So, lying in that hospital bed after surgery, the memories came crashing in, and I realized I had been walking the same road for years. My parents' refusal to help me on Christmas Eve wasn't new. It was the final straw on a pile that had been crushing me since childhood. I reached for my phone, scrolling through the missed calls and messages. Dozens from my parents, dozens more from Jessica. At first, I ignored them. I didn't have the energy. But when I finally read them, it was predictable confusion, then anger, then begging for money. They wanted mortgage help. They wanted to keep their cruise tickets. Not once did they ask how my surgery had gone. And then there was Jessica's message. Different. Short, stunned, almost apologetic mom and dad said it was just a minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they freaking out about money? I felt something twist inside me. She had no idea. They had lied to her too, painting me as dramatic, hiding the truth to protect their concert plans. For the first time, I wondered if maybe Jessica wasn't my enemy at all. Maybe she was another victim of the same manipulation, just in a different way. When I finally told her everything, the emergency surgery, the risk of not surviving, the fact that they had refused to watch the twins, her reply was immediate. "Oh my God, Hannah, I had no idea. I would have come. I'm so sorry." Her words did not erase the years of rivalry, but they planted a seed. Maybe the golden child wasn't cruel. Maybe she had just been raised in a system where her needs always came first, and she never thought to question it. It left me thinking about how families write stories in our heads. Stories about who we are, who deserves love, who must stay silent. I had lived too long under the script that said, "You are the burden, you must earn approval." But now I was rewriting it. And I wonder, have you ever lived under a story someone else wrote for you? A script that told you who you were supposed to be even when it didn't match the truth inside you? If you have, tell me in the comments. I want to know how you broke free, or if you are still searching for the courage to do it. Sharing your story might give someone else the push they need to find their own freedom. Because for me, that hospital bed became more than a place of pain. It became the place where I woke up not just from surgery, but from years of blindness. For the first time, I was ready to see my parents clearly. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. Yeah. The days after surgery were a blur of medication, slow recovery, and quiet moments watching Olivia play with my children. But beneath the exhaustion, a new strength was forming. My parents had taken enough from me. It was time to take my life back. The first time I saw Olivia, with Ethan and Emily, something in me loosened. She arrived in the hospital room with an ease that felt almost unreal, kneeling down to meet my twins at eye level. Emily clutched her giraffe tighter, but Olivia spoke in a gentle voice that melted their fear. Within minutes, Ethan was showing her his toy truck, babbling in the way only a toddler can. I watched from my bed, tears rising, not from pain this time, but from relief. Olivia carried an energy I had not felt in my home for months. Calm, capable, steady. She was introduced as a nanny who had once worked with trauma survivors' children scarred by circumstances they never chose. My children had already been touched by trauma, the sudden loss of their father, the cold indifference of their grandparents. And yet, here was a woman who saw them not as burdens, but as precious. I whispered to Valerie, "How much will this cost? I don't know if I can afford." Valerie shook her head gently. "We'll figure that out later. Right now, you need to focus on surviving." But my mind spun anyway. I thought of the $2,500 I had been wiring to my parents every month without fail, no matter the cost to myself. I thought of the bills piling up after James's death, of the nights I lay awake, wondering how long I could keep us afloat. My parents had soaked up my sacrifice like it was their birthright. And now, when I needed something as simple as babysitting during life-or-death surgery, they chose music and lights over my children. That was the moment clarity settled in. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't trapped, I still had choices. I asked Valerie to bring me my phone. My fingers shook as I opened the banking app and canceled the transfer scheduled for the following week. A flood of relief coursed through me, stronger than any medication. Then I typed the words I had carried inside me for too long. I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Do not contact me again." The message sent with a simple tap, but the weight it lifted was immense. For years, I had carried the idea that loyalty to my parents meant endless giving, that being a good daughter meant erasing myself for their comfort. But as Olivia sang softly to Emily, coaxing a smile from her, I understood something profound. The real loyalty I owed was to my children. I lay back exhausted but lighter, watching Olivia create a little circle of safety around Ethan and Emily. In that circle, they laughed, they played, they were seen, and I realized how wrong I had been to keep begging love from people who could not give it. The hallway outside echoed with the sounds of hospital carts rolling by, the beeping of distant machines. But inside that room, something shifted. It was as if I had finally locked the door on years of manipulation, letting in someone new who brought warmth instead of cold demands. James used to tell me we'll build our own family, one that knows how to love. Losing him had made me doubt that promise. But watching Olivia care for my children, I could almost hear his voice again, reminding me that family isn't defined by bloodlines. It's defined by love, by presence, by sacrifice, that comes freely, not demanded. When the surgical team came to wheel me away, Olivia held Emily's tiny hand. Ethan toddled beside her. For the first time that night, I felt safe leaving them. I knew they would be cared for, not because of obligation, but because someone wanted to be there. As the doors to the operating room closed behind me, I thought of my parents, of all the chances they had to show me love, to prove me wrong about their indifference. They failed every single time. I let that truth burn inside me, not to destroy me, but to cauterize the wound. Their absence no longer left me bleeding. It left me free. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the anesthesia carry me under. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain when I woke: my life would never be the same. I had chosen to cut the cord, and I would never tie myself back to it again. The surgery saved my body, but in those hours before, a different kind of surgery saved my spirit. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the afterthought. I was the author of my own story. The days after surgery blurred together, stitched by pain medication and the steady presence of Olivia. She was there each morning, her voice soft but firm, as she guided Ethan and Emily through breakfast games and nap time. Watching her with my children was like seeing sunlight break through clouds I had thought permanent. They trusted her instinctively, the way children can sense when someone's heart is safe. But as I regained fragments of strength, old memories began to flood in, uninvited and relentless. They painted a picture I had ignored for far too long. The truth was clear: my parents' rejection on Christmas Eve wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was simply the latest act in a play they had been rehearsing my whole life. I remembered being 12 years old, running home, clutching a ribbon from a regional spelling bee. I had practiced for weeks, trembling with nerves, but still placing in the top 3. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would be proud. Instead, they brushed it aside, because Jessica had landed a spot in a school talent show. My ribbon collected dust in a drawer forgotten. Years later, when I graduated with honors, the cycle repeated. My parents offered polite congratulations, but the spotlight shifted immediately to Jessica's commercial appearance. They spoke about it at every family gathering, as though I hadn't worked through sleepless nights and relentless exams to earn my degree. At my wedding, their complaint wasn't about joy or beauty, it was about inconvenience. Too far to drive, my mother muttered, as though celebrating my marriage was an errand on their to-do list. And when Ethan and Emily were born, their only visit ended quickly with the excuse that the babies were too fussy. They never came back. Piece by piece, these memories constructed a story I had refused to see in their world. Jessica was the golden child, and I was the shadow. Their treatment of me during my surgery was not shocking, it was inevitable. As I lay in bed recovering, I asked myself why I had continued sending money every month. Why had I sacrificed so much when they had given so little? The answer was painful. I was still that little girl chasing their approval. I had believed that if I just gave more, they would finally look at me with pride. But looking at my children now, I knew I could not pass that inheritance down to them. Ethan and Emily deserved to grow up knowing they were enough without having to prove it without begging for love. I thought about the money I had been sending, $2,500 every month, almost a third of my income. I had told myself it was my duty that family should support family. But now I realized I had been paying for their comfort with my own silence. That money could go to childcare, to an emergency fund, to building a life where my children and I weren't one tragedy away from collapse. The realization was heavy, but it was also liberating. By cutting them off, I wasn't just refusing to pay their bills. I was refusing to let them write the story of my worth. So, I have to pause here. Because maybe some of you watching this are carrying the same weight. Maybe you've been told you owe your family everything, even when they've given you nothing but disappointment. I want you to hear this. Supporting someone should never cost you your dignity. If you've ever felt trapped by guilt or obligation, share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories that remind us we're not alone, make sure to subscribe. It helps me keep building this community where our voices are finally heard. As the days passed, Olivia became more than a nanny. She became part of the circle of trust I was slowly creating. And with her help, I was strong enough to confront the next wave of betrayal that was waiting because my parents were not finished trying to pull me back into their orbit. But this time, I wasn't the same woman who had whispered into the phone begging for help on Christmas Eve. I had cut the cord, and I was ready to defend that choice no matter the cost. 6 months before that Christmas Eve, my life had shattered in a way that still made my chest ache when I thought about it. James, my husband. My anchor was killed by a drunk driver on a night that was supposed to be ordinary. One moment, he was on his way home, and the next, I was answering the door to a police officer whose face carried the weight of the worst news imaginable. I remember dropping to the floor, my hands clutching my stomach as if I could hold the world together by sheer force. Ethan and Emily were only toddlers then, too small to understand, too small to remember the sound of their father's laugh or the way he used to scoop them up into his arms after work. But I remembered every detail, and the absence of it nearly swallowed me. In those weeks after James's death, grief came in waves so strong that sometimes I thought I might drown. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for a door that would never open again, waiting for footsteps that would never return. And in those nights of despair, my parents' words of comfort were nowhere to be found. Instead, they hinted about rising costs and bills piling up. So what did I do? I increased their allowance. Even in the middle of my own devastation, I sent more than the usual $2,500, telling myself it was the right thing. That family should not suffer. I thought maybe if I showed them generosity in my darkest hour, they would show me compassion in return. How foolish that belief seems now. I drained savings meant for emergencies, even touched the small insurance payout James had left. That money could have gone toward therapy, toward childcare, toward building a future for Ethan and Emily. But instead, it went into my parents' mortgage, their vacations, their quiet life of ease. They did not once suggest easing my burden. They did not offer to watch the twins so I could grieve. They simply accepted my sacrifice as if it were owed. James used to talk about how we would build our own family, one built on love and trust. He had grown up estranged from his own father, so he understood the wound of neglect. "We'll do it differently," he would say. "Our kids will never question if they are loved." When he died, I clung to those words like a lifeline. But standing in the hospital, begging my parents to care for their grandchildren, I realized I had failed him in one critical way. I had allowed his children to feel the same rejection he had known. My parents' refusal on Christmas Eve was not just about me. It was about Ethan and Emily, who were learning far too early what it meant to be unwanted. The irony still stings. I was bleeding internally, the doctors telling me I could die, and my parents couldn't even press pause on their evening plans. That was when the last illusion crumbled. Looking back, I wonder if part of me had always known. Maybe that is why I kept giving, why I kept trying to fill the void with money. It was easier to send dollars than to face the truth that love had never truly existed between us. But the truth has a way of demanding to be seen. And in that hospital room, as Olivia held Emily close and Ethan played with his truck, I saw it clearly: my children deserved better. James had wanted better for them, and I had the power to give it to them, even if it meant cutting out the people who shared my blood. The grief of losing James will never disappear. It is stitched into me. But grief also gave me clarity. It stripped away the illusions and forced me to see who stood by me when the storm hit, and who chose to run toward the concert lights instead. Now every decision I made was measured against a simple question: what would give Ethan and Emily the love James wanted them to know? And the answer every time was, this: choose people who show up. The night before surgery, I made a choice that would change everything. It was not the doctors or the medication that gave me courage. It was the look on Ethan's face as he clutched his blanket, and the way Emily pressed her tiny giraffe to her chest. Their eyes were filled with trust. They did not see a burden. They saw their mother. And I could not allow anyone, not even my own parents, to teach them otherwise. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling but determined. I opened my banking app and canceled every automatic transfer to my parents' account. For 3 years, that money had flowed like an unbroken chain, $2,500 every month. But with one click, I broke the chain. Then I opened a new message. The words poured out of me as if they had been waiting for this moment. I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Do not contact me again. I stared at the screen for a long moment before pressing send. The message was short, sharp, and final. And the instant it left my phone, I felt it: freedom. Not relief, not joy, not even anger. Just freedom. The kind of freedom you don't recognize until you've lived years without it. As the minutes ticked by, I expected panic to creep in. Instead, I felt calm. For once, I had stopped begging for love that would never come. For once, I had drawn a line and chosen to protect myself and my children. When Valerie wheeled me toward the operating room, I whispered to her, I cut them off. She gave my hand a squeeze and said, "Good. You deserve peace." Peace. It was such a small word, but I realized I had not truly felt it in decades. Inside the sterile hallways, the lights glaring above me, I thought about how often I had bent over backward to keep the peace with my parents. I gave money, I gave time, I gave pieces of myself, all to avoid their anger. But real peace had never lived in that arrangement. Real peace lived in truth. And tonight, I had finally told it. As the anesthesia pulled me under, I thought about James. I imagined him smiling, that gentle smile of his, the one that said he was proud of me. Proud not because I was perfect, not because I had given more than I had, but because I had finally chosen myself and our children. When I woke hours later, weak and groggy, I was not the same woman who had entered that operating room. The surgery had saved my body, but the decision I made before it had saved my soul. I want to stop here and ask you something. Have you ever had to cut ties with someone you loved, even though it tore at your heart? Have you ever hit send on a message that ended years of guilt and obligation? If you have, share it in the comments. Someone out there may need to hear your courage to find their own. The days that followed were difficult. Recovery was slow and pain was constant. But even in the midst of it, I felt lighter. Olivia stayed by my side, guiding Ethan and Emily with patience and warmth. And as I watched my children begin to trust her, I understood blood might bind us, but it is love that builds us. For the first time, I believed I could build something stronger than what I had been given. A life without manipulation, a family without conditions, a future where Ethan and Emily would never grow up thinking love was measured in dollars or sacrifice. And that realization, more than anything else, gave me strength to heal. The first days after surgery felt like drifting in and out of fog. My body was weak, stitched together by threads of exhaustion and pain. Yet through that haze, one thing remained constant: Olivia's presence. She was a steady rhythm in the chaos, guiding Ethan and Emily through each day as if she had known them forever. I would wake in the hospital room to the sound of her voice, soft but clear, telling Ethan to share his blocks with Emily, or singing a lullaby while Emily fought sleep. She was not just caring for them, she was building trust, brick by brick, in a way that made my children feel secure when I could not hold them. Watching her, I felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude because she was saving us. Guilt because I had spent so much energy giving to the wrong people, when I could have been building this kind of circle all along. At night when Olivia took the twins back to my apartment, the silence in the hospital room felt heavy. It was in those hours that my phone lit up endlessly blinking with missed calls and text notifications. 27 calls, dozens of messages, but not one of them asked about my surgery. Not one asked if I was alive. I forced myself to read a few. Where is the mortgage payment? You cannot just cut us off like this. We already booked our cruise tickets. They are non-refundable. Their words were sharp, cold, entitled. It was as if my body lying open on an operating table was invisible to them. All that mattered was the hole in their bank account. I scrolled further. Jessica's messages were different, confused, almost frantic. Mom and Dad said it was just a minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they panicking about money? It hit me then. They had lied to her too. They had taken my emergency surgery with its very real risk of death and painted it as a routine checkup. They had concealed the truth to protect their reputation, to avoid admitting they had chosen a concert over their grandchildren's safety. I told Jessica the truth, typing slowly through the fog of medication, the bleeding, the surgery, the refusal to help. Her reply came quickly. "Oh my God, Hannah, I had no idea. I would have come. I'm so sorry." Her words stunned me. For years I had seen her as my rival, the golden child who could do no wrong. But maybe she had been misled all along, shaped by the same lies that had poisoned me. The thought didn't erase the pain of the past, but it opened a door, one I never expected to consider. Meanwhile, my parents' messages grew more desperate. They moved from anger to pleading back to anger again. My father's last text read, "You cannot just abandon us like this. We have bills. You owe us." Oh. That word struck deep. I had spent my entire life believing I owed them everything, time, money, my silence. But lying in that hospital bed, I realized the truth: I owed them nothing. My responsibility was to Ethan and Emily, and to myself. Olivia returned the next morning with the twins. Ethan toddled to my bed, pressing his truck into my hand, while Emily climbed carefully beside me. They didn't care about concerts or cruises. They didn't measure my worth in dollars. They just wanted their mother alive and present. I kissed their heads and whispered, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Looking back, I think that was the moment I finally understood what survival meant. It wasn't just about living through surgery. It was about breaking the chains that had bound me to people who never saw me. It was about creating space for those who did. And so I began to let the old world fall away. I silenced my parents' messages. I stopped explaining myself. Every ounce of energy I had went to healing and to holding Ethan and Emily close. Because at the end of the day, survival isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up. And Olivia had shown up in ways my parents never had. Jessica's reply kept replaying in my head. "I would have come. I'm so sorry." For years I had seen her as the golden child, the one who soaked up every ounce of attention while I was left with scraps. I never questioned it, because my parents worked so hard to paint me as the problem. But now, with one text, the ground shifted. When she visited me a week after my surgery, I didn't know what to expect. I half imagined her walking in with my parents' sharp tone demanding explanations. Instead, she stood in the doorway holding a casserole dish, her eyes red like she had been crying. "I didn't know," she said immediately. "They told me you were being dramatic, that it was some routine thing. If I had known..." Her voice cracked. For a moment I couldn't speak. Decades of resentment tangled with the new possibility that maybe she hadn't chosen to stand against me. Maybe she had been manipulated too. She sat with me watching Ethan and Emily play on the hospital floor. Slowly, cautiously, she admitted things I had never heard from her before. "They always made it seem like you were pulling away, that you didn't want to be part of the family. I believed them." Her words hit like a confession, and a revelation rolled into one. My parents had written a script where I was the outsider and Jessica was the chosen one. We both played our parts without knowing the stage was built on lies. I told her everything, how I had sent thousands of dollars to cover their mortgage even after James died, how on Christmas Eve they refused to care for the twins because of a concert, how I had begged them voice cracking only to be called a burden. Jessica sat in silence, her face pale with shock. "They lied to me," she whispered. "They always said you were exaggerating, making yourself the victim. I believed them." Her remorse didn't erase the years of distance, but it cracked the armor of isolation I had carried for so long. For the first time, I saw my sister not as the enemy, but as another casualty of our parents' manipulation. Still, a part of me hesitated. Could I trust her now? Could she really understand the weight of what had been done? Over the next week, she visited again, this time with toys for the twins. She cooked meals, helped Olivia when I was too weak to get out of bed. She laughed with Ethan braided Emily's hair. And in those small acts, I began to believe she wasn't just performing, she was trying. But here's the thing, trust once broken doesn't return in an instant. It's rebuilt slowly, cautiously. And though Jessica's words comforted me, the shadow of doubt remained. My parents had twisted stories for so long that it was hard to separate truth from deception. What I did know was this: something in the family dynamic had shifted. My parents no longer held the same power. Jessica had begun to see them for who they really were. And that shift would set off a chain of events that none of us could have predicted. I need to pause here. Because what happened next, it was the turning point. It's the part of the story that forced me to choose between slipping back into old patterns or stepping fully into a new life. You might think you know where this is going, but I promise you don't. Stay with me, because the confrontation that followed changed everything. For now I'll leave you with this. Sometimes the greatest betrayal doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes from the people who taught you the meaning of the word family. And when that truth finally comes to light, you have two choices: cling to the lies that kept you safe, or walk into the unknown with nothing but your own strength. I was about to find out which choice I would make. It happened one gray afternoon, not long after I was discharged from the hospital. I was still weak, moving slowly around my apartment, when a knock rattled my front door. Through the peephole, I saw them, my parents. My mother clutched a designer purse against her chest, her expression painted with nervous sweetness. My father stood with arms crossed, impatience etched into every line of his face. My pulse quickened. Part of me wanted to ignore the knock, but another part knew this moment was inevitable. I cracked the door just enough to meet their eyes. "What do you want?" My voice was steadier than I expected. "Hannah, darling, we've been so worried," my mother cooed, her tone sugary enough to rot teeth. "You haven't answered our calls. We needed to make sure you and the twins are all right." I almost laughed. Not once had they asked about my health in their messages, but here they were, cloaked in false concern. "We're fine," I said flatly, "if that's all." "It's not all," my father interrupted, pushing against the doorframe as if he might wedge himself inside. "We need to talk about this ridiculous financial situation. The bank called about our mortgage payment. We had to dip into our cruise savings." The audacity of it left me breathless. Not a word about my surgery, not a word about their grandchildren, only money, always money. "I told you," I said firmly, "I'm cutting financial ties. I meant it." My mother's voice rose an octave. "But sweetie, we've come to depend on that money. Your father and I adjusted our lifestyle based on your commitment to help us." "Commitment." My voice sharpened. "I've been sending money out of guilt while you ignored me, ignored your grandchildren, and went to a concert instead of being there when I might have died." My father's face darkened. "That's not fair, Hannah. We had plans." "Plans more important than my life." My anger surged. "Do you even know what the doctors told me? There was a chance I wouldn't survive that surgery. Did you bother to ask?" Silence. Their faces said everything their words refused to. "We made one mistake," my mother whispered, dramatically, tears welling in her eyes. "This isn't punishment, Mom. This is consequence." My voice felt calm, now solid. "I spent my whole life begging for your approval, and when I needed you most, you chose Elton John tickets. I'm done." My father straightened, puffing up his chest. "We're your parents. You owe us respect." "And I'm a parent too," I countered, my voice steady. I will never treat Ethan and Emily the way you've treated me. Ever. Just then, Emily toddled into view, clutching her giraffe. My mother's tone flipped instantly. "There's my precious grandbaby," she cried, kneeling down. But Emily, sensing the tension, backed away and pressed herself against my legs. I bent down, stroked Emily's hair, and whispered, "It's okay." Then I looked up at my parents. "I think you should leave. If I'm ever ready to talk, I'll reach out. Until then, the money is no longer your concern." I closed the door before they could protest. My hands shook, but not from fear. For the first time, they shook with the adrenaline of standing my ground. I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you finally said no to someone who had held power over you for years? A moment where you slammed the door, literally or figuratively, on manipulation. Share it in the comments. Your story might give courage to someone still standing at that same door. Bye. The next morning the knocking returned, but this time they hadn't come alone. Standing with them was my Aunt Patty, the so-called peacemaker of the family. I didn't open the door. I only listened as she pleaded from the hallway. "Hannah, honey, be reasonable. Your parents are struggling without your help." Her words were meant to guilt me, but they only confirmed what I already knew. They weren't here for me. They were here for the money. And that realization hardened something in me that would not bend again. The pounding on my door finally stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. My parents were never the type to accept no quietly. They thrived on control, on weaving stories that made them the victims, and everyone else the villain. So I wasn't surprised when the next attack came, not in person, but in the form of a carefully crafted email. It arrived one afternoon while Olivia was reading to the twins. My phone buzzed with a group notification subject line, "A Family Matter." The sender, my father. My stomach sank as I opened it. The email was addressed to our entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Line by line, my father painted me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her parents after they had sacrificed everything for me. He claimed I had suddenly cut them off financially without reason, leaving them at risk of losing their home. The words dripped with self-pity. They were victims, and I was the cold, heartless betrayer. What he didn't mention, of course, was that they had refused to watch their grandchildren during my emergency surgery. He didn't mention that I had spent years wiring them $2,500 a month. He didn't mention that they had chosen Elton John tickets over my life. My hands shook as I read. Not from guilt this time, but from rage. For so long they had controlled the narrative. Now they were trying to do it again, casting me as the villain to anyone who would listen. The replies began to roll in almost immediately. Some were cautious, sympathetic toward my parents. Others, however, cut straight through their facade. My cousin Michael replied publicly, "Uncle Robert, didn't you just buy a new boat last month? And Aunt Diana, wasn't that a new diamond tennis bracelet you showed off at Thanksgiving?" The silence that followed was telling. Privately, messages began flooding my phone. Cousins asking, "Is this true?" And aunt writing, "We had no idea you were in surgery. They told us you were fine." Even Aunt Patty, the peacemaker, called me directly, her voice hushed. "Hannah, I didn't know. They said it was routine, that you were being dramatic. If I had known, I never would have come to your door like that." For the first time in my life, I felt something shift within the family dynamic. The story was unraveling. The truth was breaking through the web my parents had spun for decades. Jessica, too, stood firmly on my side. She had seen their behavior firsthand, and she was furious. "They've been lying to all of us," she said. "I'm done protecting them." She sat with me that evening, helping me draft a single factual reply to the entire family thread. No anger, no embellishment, just the truth. I typed slowly, deliberately. "I recently underwent emergency surgery with a significant risk of complications. My parents refused to watch my children during this time because they had concert tickets. I have chosen to focus on my recovery and caring for my twins without additional stress." That was it. No drama, no insults, just truth. The response was overwhelming. Cousin Michael's wife dropped off home-cooked meals. A second cousin I barely knew offered to babysit for free. Neighbors began checking in. Even Valerie from the hospital connected me with a support group for young widowed parents. For the first time since James died, I felt seen not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but as part of a community. My parents' attempts to manipulate had backfired. The very web they tried to spin around me ended up exposing their own hypocrisy. They had wanted to make me the villain, but now everyone could see who they really were. I realized something powerful in that moment. When you step out of the fog of guilt and manipulation, you give others the chance to see the truth too. And sometimes the truth is enough to dismantle even the strongest lies. But this battle was far from over. My parents were not finished. In fact, what came next would test me in ways I had never imagined. Their desperation would only grow, and with it, the stakes for me and my children. And I had to decide, was I strong enough to keep standing my ground when their world began to collapse? The weeks after that email war felt different. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing alone in the shadows. Instead, I was surrounded by people who chose to stand with me, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but because they cared. It was a new kind of family, one that I had always longed for, but never thought I could build. Jessica came by often, her presence cautious at first. She would bring meals she had cooked herself, sometimes showing up with bags of groceries. She sat on the floor with Ethan and Emily, laughing with them, slowly becoming more than the sister who once lived in my parents' orbit. She was learning to be their aunt in a way that was real. And in those moments, I saw glimpses of what we might have been if manipulation hadn't poisoned us. Olivia, steady as ever, was now woven into the rhythm of our days. She would arrive in the mornings, giving me time to heal and rebuild strength, while also offering the twins stability. Watching her guide Ethan through coloring or coax Emily into naps, I realized how wrong I had been to keep pouring myself into people who gave nothing back. The love I craved had been here all along in the hands of strangers who chose to show up. Even my extended family surprised me. Michael's wife dropped off meals almost weekly. A cousin I barely knew offered babysitting so I could rest. Valerie, the nurse who had saved me in those darkest hours, connected me to a support group for young widowed parents. That first Zoom call with the group changed me. Faces stared back at me, men and women who had lost partners too soon, who were raising children while carrying grief on their backs. They listened when I told my story, and when I finished, they didn't tell me I was dramatic or that I should forgive and forget. They said, "We understand." Those words landed like a balm on wounds I had carried for too long. For the first time since James's death, I felt truly seen. Meanwhile, my parents' lives were unraveling. Jessica discovered they had taken out a second mortgage to buy their boat and timeshare, fully expecting me to cover their primary mortgage forever. Their finances were a house of cards collapsing under their own greed. They left me voicemails, their voices raw with desperation, begging me to reconsider. But with every plea, their grip on me grew weaker. One night as I tucked Ethan and Emily into bed, I thought of James again. He had always promised we would build a family that knew how to love. And maybe I was finally doing it, not with the people I was born to, but with those who had chosen me. I lay awake that night feeling something unfamiliar, hope. I want to pause here because this is where the story bends in ways even I didn't expect. Up to this point, my parents had manipulated, lied, and spun webs of guilt. But when desperation tightened its grip, they did something that shocked even me. And what they did next nearly pulled me back into the storm. So stay with me, because the twist that came after this moment would test everything I thought I had rebuilt. But before we get there, I want to ask you, have you ever found yourself building a new kind of family? One made not from blood, but from the people who chose to stand beside you when life fell apart. Tell me in the comments, because those stories matter. They remind us that we are never truly alone, no matter how much our past tried to convince us otherwise. The call came late one evening, Jessica's voice tight with urgency. They got a foreclosure notice, she said. The bank gave them 60 days. They're in full panic mode. I sat at the kitchen table, Ethan asleep in his room, Emily humming softly to her stuffed giraffe. My hands tightened around the phone. What about their retirement funds, I asked. Mostly gone, Jessica admitted. They spent a big chunk on the boat and timeshare. The rest? Dad invested with one of his golf buddies. It was a bad deal. They lost almost everything. Her words hung heavy in the air. For years I had believed I was holding them afloat. Now I realized I had simply been funding a lifestyle built on sand. Without my money, the tide had swept it all away. Soon after the desperate messages started, my mother's voice cracked in one voicemail. "We never thought you'd actually cut us off. We assumed you were angry and would cool down." My father's texts were harsher. "We need $144,000 to catch up. It's the least you can do." I wanted to laugh at the audacity, but beneath that laughter was rage. For decades they had drained me dry, and now they expected me to rescue them again, after refusing to even watch my children while I was on an operating table. Jessica tried to mediate. She met with them, went through their accounts, and called me afterward exasperated. They could fix this if they sold the boat and timeshare, but they don't want to. They call them retirement luxuries. Retirement luxuries. I nearly choked on the phrase. My children had lost their father. I had nearly lost my life. Yet my parents clung to luxuries like they were oxygen, still demanding I bleed for them. They showed up at my apartment again this time with spreadsheets of debts and a rehearsed plea. My father's tone wavered between command and desperation. "You can afford this, Hannah. It's the least you can do after everything we've done for you." I looked at them across my small dining table and asked, "What exactly have you done for me?" Silence. My mother's eyes darted to the twins who were playing with blocks in the corner. "There are our precious grandbabies," she crooned, reaching out. But Ethan pulled away, and Emily hid behind my chair. They didn't know these people. They didn't want them. That was the truth. They had chosen distance. They had chosen concerts, cruises, and comfort over showing up. Now, when the consequences of their choices arrived, they wanted me to erase them with money. I straightened in my chair. "You'll survive," I said. "The same way I did when I lost James. The same way I did when you turned your back on me during surgery. You'll survive without me." Their faces crumpled, whether from genuine fear or failed manipulation I couldn't tell, but I didn't flinch. I had learned that compassion without boundaries is just another word for captivity. I need to say this. Many of you watching may have faced the same guilt. Maybe you've been told that because they're family, you owe them everything, even when everything leaves you empty. But I want you to hear this. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are survival. If you've ever had to cut off toxic ties, share it below. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, subscribe and join this community. Because here, we choose truth over guilt. Why? 3 months after my surgery, the inevitable happened. My parents sold the big lakefront house, the boat, even the timeshare. They downsized into a modest condo, and word spread through the family that they blamed me for every ounce of their downfall. But instead of shame, I felt something unexpected: peace. Because while they were losing their illusions of grandeur, I was building something real. And that I realized was the difference between us. Spring came quietly, carrying with it a sense of rebirth that I had not felt in years. By then, the chaos surrounding my parents' downfall had settled into background noise. Jessica updated me occasionally, telling me how they complained endlessly about the condo, about selling the boat, about losing their precious timeshare. But I had stopped letting their misery take root in me. Their losses were not mine anymore. Instead, I poured my energy into something new, something that felt like hope. With the help of Diana, a woman I had met through the widowed parent support group, I sold my cramped apartment and bought a small 3-bedroom house in a family-friendly neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it had what my children needed most: space, safety, and a backyard. The first time Ethan and Emily ran barefoot across the grass, shrieking with laughter, I stood on the porch and cried. Not out of grief this time, but out of gratitude. For once, I was watching them play in a space that was ours, built not from guilt or obligation, but from my own choices. The mortgage payments were actually less than what I had paid in rent before. That alone felt like freedom. But more than numbers, it was the symbolism I had created a home, a place where Ethan and Emily would grow up, never doubting their worth. Work shifted too. Inspired by the memorial website I had made for James, I began designing similar sites for others in my support group. It started small, a single request, then another. Soon, word spread. People wanted a way to remember their loved ones, and I gave them that. Each site I built felt like stitching something meaningful back into the fabric of grief. For the first time since James's death, I felt purpose beyond survival. Olivia stayed part-time caring for the twins while I worked. Her presence was a lifeline, but also a reminder that help could exist without strings attached. My neighbors surprised me as well, dropping off casseroles, inviting us to barbecues, folding us into a community I hadn't realized I needed. And Jessica slowly, steadily became more than a sister by blood. She became a sister by choice. She spent weekends at my house playing with the twins, sometimes staying late to talk about how our parents had shaped us both. She confessed things I had never known, like how suffocating it was to always be the golden child expected to shine even when she wanted to rest. For the first time, I saw her not as my rival, but as a woman who had been trapped in a different kind of cage. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. The scar from surgery still throbbed on bad days. Nights still carried echoes of James's absence. But the balance had shifted. For once, the grief was not the only thing in the room. There was laughter too. There was possibility. I had thought that cutting ties with my parents would leave me empty, but instead it made space for something better. My children thrived in the absence of their cruelty. I thrived in the absence of their demands. Together we were learning how to live without apology. Sometimes I would sit on the porch after putting the twins to bed, listening to the sounds of our neighborhood, the hum of sprinklers, children riding bikes past dogs barking in backyards. And I would think this is what freedom feels like. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet and steady, like breathing without pain. It would have been easy to believe the story ended there, with me building a new life, while my parents sank into the consequences of their choices. But life rarely ties things up so neatly, because 1 year after my surgery, I received something unexpected, a letter, handwritten, from my mother. And inside that envelope was the one thing I never thought I would see: an apology. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 full days before I opened it. I had recognized my mother's handwriting instantly, looping and dramatic, the kind of script she had always bragged about as elegant. I nearly tossed it in the trash without a glance. But something inside me, curiosity perhaps, made me tear it open. Inside was a letter unlike anything I had ever received from her. No demands, no accusations, just words that startled me with their tone. I have had time to reflect on my behavior. Watching you build a life without our help has forced me to face some painful truths. She admitted jealousy, resentment. She confessed that my independence had always unsettled her, that she had wanted me to need her in ways I never did. And then she wrote the words I had longed to hear, but never expected. When you asked us to care for the twins during your surgery, you were reaching out and we failed you completely. I am deeply sorry. I read it twice, then a third time, my emotions caught between disbelief and anger. For years, apologies had been weapons in my family, thinly veiled manipulations meant to reset the cycle of guilt. Was this different? Or was it just another act in their endless performance? When Jessica came by later, I showed her the letter. She frowned. "They've been talking about writing you for weeks. Dad was against it at first. But after his health scare, chest pains, high blood pressure, he's been different. Maybe this is real. Maybe. Or maybe it was survival instinct." I thought about it for days before agreeing to meet them. Not at my home, not in their condo, but at a quiet cafe in town, neutral ground. When they walked in, I barely recognized them. My father, once so domineering, looked smaller somehow. His posture had lost its swagger, his face lined with worry. My mother, once draped in designer clothes, now wore something simple, practical. We sat in silence at first, the clink of dishes filling the air. Then for the first time in my life, my father cried. "I've been a terrible father," he said, his voice breaking, "and an even worse grandfather. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see it now." My mother reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close. "We've been going to therapy," she admitted. "It was Jessica's idea. At first we resisted, but it's helped." I didn't rush to speak. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence or smooth the edges of their guilt. Instead, I pulled out photos of Ethan and Emily, showing them their laughter in the backyard, their first attempts at riding bikes. My parents listened quietly. They didn't interrupt. They didn't make it about themselves. For the first time, maybe ever, they just listened. When the meal ended, my father asked softly, "Would it be possible someday to know our grandchildren?" I looked at him carefully. "That depends," I said. "On your actions, not your words. If you're truly committed to change, then maybe. But understand this, my children will only have relationships with people who respect their mother." They both nodded, subdued. It wasn't a reconciliation, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a boundary, and this time the boundary was mine. Walking out of that cafe, I didn't feel the crushing weight of obligation anymore. Nor did I feel the fiery resentment that had once consumed me. Instead, I felt something steadier, the calm assurance of a woman who knew her worth, a mother who had drawn lines in the sand and would not let anyone erase them. Because here's the truth, people can change, but only time proves it. And whether my parents truly had or not, I had already transformed. I was no longer the daughter desperate for approval. I was the mother fierce in her protection, clear in her expectations, and unafraid to walk away if those expectations weren't met. Before I end, I want to leave you with this. Sometimes the hardest freedom you'll ever claim is the freedom from people you once thought you couldn't live without. If you've ever stood in that space caught between hope and self-protection, share your story in the comments. And if you want to hear what happened next in my journey and stories from others who have fought for their own peace, click on the next video. You'll see how setting boundaries doesn't just change one life, it can ripple through generations. The seasons turned, and with them, so did the rhythm of our lives. A year had passed since that Christmas Eve in the hospital, a night that had once felt like the end of everything. Now, when I looked around my small house, with its backyard full of laughter, I realized it had been the beginning instead. Ethan and Emily were thriving. They raced barefoot through the grass, their laughter carrying through open windows, their faces radiant with joy that came from knowing they were loved without condition. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee kissed, every whispered, "I love you," as a promise, kept not just to them, but to myself. I was different too. No longer the daughter chasing approval, I had become the woman. James always believed I could be resilient, strong, unapologetically free. My parents' apology had opened the door to possibility, but it was my boundaries that kept me safe. Whether or not they truly changed was no longer the measure of my peace. The measure was here in the life I had built with my children in the community that had chosen us in the quiet courage I carried every day. Some nights when the house was still and the twins were asleep, I would step into the yard and look up at the stars. I thought of James, of the love that had once anchored me, and the promise we had made to build a family that knew how to love. Despite everything, I had kept that promise. And in those moments, I felt it fully, the gentle, unwavering truth. I was no longer anyone's afterthought. I was the author of my own story. And that story was only just beginning.